Hi, we're complete.
Okay, great. Then we can now proceed. All right, we'll just start off with introductions. So hello, everybody. My name is Chancel, and I will be chairing this semifinal. Congratulations for both teams for making it thus far. This has been an incredibly competitive tournament, and you guys have done very well to do so. Judging alongside me is going to be a wonderful panel of judges. Judges, would you like to just briefly introduce yourselves?
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel. No preference for pronouns, and good luck for the round.
My name is Shermay. No preferred gender pronouns.
My name is Venus. My preferred gender pronouns are she and her.
Claudia, no preference.
Hi, my name is Kaida. I have no preferred pronouns.
Hi, I'm Philip. He, him, please.
All right. A couple of points of housekeeping before we begin. Firstly, if speakers have any preferred gender pronouns, please state them before giving your speech. And we ask that all speakers respect those gendered pronouns. If not, that's fine. If there are none, that's also fine. Secondly, please state your preferred way of taking POIs before giving your speech. If a speaker does not specify the way in which they would like to receive POIs, please do so through the chat. Other than that, I think we are good to go. All right, without further ado, first prop.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
My preferred pronouns are she, her, and you can ask me verbal POIs. Panel, Kamala Harris is one in millions, but yet when she was elected as Vice President of the United States, people celebrated it as an achievement of the Black Indian community. They celebrated it as an achievement of women around the world. She got on stage and she gave women and marginalized communities certain criteria, things like hard work, perseverance. And if you choose to do those things in your life, you will be able to get on this podium and say the same things that I am. This is the problem with celebrating members of marginalized communities for where they have come from and to where they are now, because of the fact that it ignores the structural barriers that exist in getting individuals there. And for that, I'm so proud to propose this motion. A quick definition of what we characterize as celebration in this debate. It looks at attaching individual success to the success of the wider community. So it is not just Kamala Harris's achievement, but it is the achievement of the Black community. It is the achievement of women, but not just the achievement, like an acknowledgement of hard work that these people have gone through, but a recognition that there is increased progress for these communities in order for this woman to get to where she is. But second, it is creating this idea that your background is never a limit, that if you do certain things, you're able to get wherever you want. But finally, it looks like whitewashing the reputation of these individuals because of the fact, like ignoring the fact that Kamala Harris may have voted for legislation that harms minorities in the past. You're just going to continue to celebrate this individual because where she has come to is so important. We have one main burden to prove, and that is that celebrating marginalized communities getting into positions of power, or members of them rather, hinders the progress that is needed for these communities in the long term. What is our counterfactual in this debate? We would acknowledge the accomplishments of these individuals for their political academic prowess in the same way that we would acknowledge any politician coming into power, regardless of their race, regardless of their background. They can talk about their struggle and how they chose to get there. We think that's perfectly fine, but the celebration of them getting there in the first place is what we are completely against. We have three arguments. The first is on the nature of celebration that has on minorities. The second is on how this hurts political discourse. And my final argument will be dealt with by my second speaker. Under the first argument, but actually before that, I will take a POI.
So do you still support politicians campaigning on basis of reforms for their minority group, like Hillary Clinton campaigning on reforms for women, for example?
Yeah, we're perfectly fine with that. We think it's okay to campaign for somebody. We don't want to celebrate on behalf of an entire community when you get into power. Under my first argument on the nature of celebration and the impact that has on minorities themselves. Note that in status quo, there are several barriers to entry in politics that exist, which means that there are structural reasons as to why you are unable to get to a certain position of power. This means that there are racist laws that prevent you from, say, running for office. This means that there are certain people who will prevent you from coming into a workplace simply because you are a woman. When you are able to get one of these people into power, who is literally just an anomaly, all of the discriminatory data that exists to show that there are structural barriers to individuals climbing the ladder is immediately ignored. And we see this in status quo. The idea that if one person is able to make something successful of themselves, that everyone else is able to do it as well. All these structural issues that hinder people from getting to certain positions just no longer exist. But second, note that most of the time when people get into come into power, they come from positions of privilege. Kamala Harris was an upper class woman who was able to go to college. She was able to get an education. There were fewer barriers to entry for her than there were for other people. The issue that you have when you celebrate these individuals for where they come from is that you make them the poster child for that minority in itself. So you are saying that the only issues that the Black community or the female community will face are the issues that Kamala Harris faces. We don't need to worry about the rest. But next, it diminishes the struggle of minorities because they still need to go through issues like paying for like extremely high health insurance, for them to having barriers to entry in accessing the workplace. But when you have one person being successful, you create a myth of a model minority. What this looks like is you present certain criteria of success, things like hard work, things like perseverance. And if you are able to achieve those things, then it is likely that it is guaranteed that you're going to be able to get to positions of power. This hurts how minorities view themselves because you directly see rhetoric being used in status quo where like people in positions of power say, I want girls watching this at home to know that you can get here as well. The reality is that that is just not going to happen, right? We're not talking about all girls following the same trajectory as Kamala Harris. There are girls who are not able to go to school. There are girls who are just not allowed to access the workplace. But finally, and this ultimately affects how these individuals view themselves because they see themselves as complacent, as not being good enough. And this leads to a culture of complacency on the part of these individuals when they recognize that they are just not lucky enough to get to these positions of power. But finally, it provides ammunition for right-wing politicians and those who are complacent to the structural issues that these minorities face to use to put the onus of success on these minorities themselves. Because when you present this criteria, if the myth that you're able to perpetuate is that if you choose to do these things, then you are likely to be successful as well. This ultimately harms structural change in the system. My second argument then on how this hurts political discourse. On a first level, note that it is harder to hold politicians who have come to these places from marginalized communities accountable because this individual is now celebrated. Like you can't call Barack Obama a bad person for like carpet bombing the Middle East because of the fact that he has overcome all of these structural barriers to get to a position of power. So even if individuals work against minority communities, like Kamala Harris passing punitive prison legislature that like forces transgender individuals to go into prisons where they don't identify with, you're not able to use that against them and say that what they're doing is wrong because they are a minority. They have achieved so many things. Who are we to say that they are wrong? But finally, celebration is zero sum, which means that the focus of media attention onto these specific individuals takes focus away from social movements. So that's our counterfactual. We're talking about an instance in which social movements are able to garner support and they're able to have the media focus on the issues that they're facing. And why are social movements far better than this one political leader? Because of the fact that they're intersectional. So we're talking about about several different issues within this movement being discussed. It's not just the one trajectory of this one individual. But second, because they consist of several different individuals coming from different places, meaning that everyone is able to get their issues voiced out, and you no longer have one person being the poster child for a certain community. But finally, you have political leaders being forced to thank and express gratitude for structures that have historically oppressed them. So Barack Obama needs to thank the White House for his position of power, ignoring the fact that it is the White House that has locked members of his community out for generations. And this is the issue with it. On our side of the house, in our counterfactual, we would have the focus exist on the ground, on people who are suffering on the ground, on marginalized communities themselves. We wouldn't attribute the success of one individual to the success of an entire community. I'm so proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks, and I'll call upon Elo first up to open the op case. Here.
Can I just have a minute to set up my camera?
Okay.
So no gender pronouns, no preferred gender pronouns. If you have a POI, just raise it vocally. Also, if I disconnect, please raise it vocally since I cannot look at the Zoom. Okay, thanks. I'll start my speech in a few. The White House, a building literally built by African-American slaves, which constantly reminded members of that minority group that they will never step into the realms of power, was suddenly redefined by people from minorities like Obama, like Kamala Harris, that were able to secure power and prove these people wrong. We are proud to celebrate individuals who were able to overcome structural barriers that for far too long have oppressed them. A couple of responses. Their first argument is that structural barriers or the talks and discussions about the actual problems of African Americans suddenly disappear when you celebrate. So there's a couple of responses to this. The first is that this is very unexclusive, right? This also exists when you have particular figureheads within movements. So for example, in the feminist movement, when we have leaders, like for example, rich white women, they're likely to also focus their problems on that. So it's not really an exclusive harm. But the second is that think about the comparative. The reason as to why it's likely for you to drown out the worse off struggles of other people in your minority is because these struggles in and of itself were not really focused to. People had no incentive to listen to them. So compare that to maybe shallower forms of issues, but at the very least, these are actual issues that are probably broad, like sexual harassment that do affect the vast majority of women on the ground. The second argument they try to push is complacency. This is very assertive. Like when people know that they can achieve something, that often empowers them to fight even harder to get it. So for example, when the feminist movement had precedents that they can get policies passed, the ability for women to protest out on the streets literally risked the fact that they could be divorced by their husbands. They're more willing to take these stances because they knew they can achieve structural reforms. Same thing with politicians like Danica Roem. When LGBT acceptance did increase, they were more empowered to actually fight for LGBT, specifically transgender rights and status quo. The third thing they tried to say is that social movements lose media attention and capital. This assertive, when you look at your notes, they give no analysis as to why this is true. In fact, I say when you highlight problems, you often include how the movement either benefited you or how the movement is currently struggling and they all need a lot more capital. So it's very hard, for example, for an African American to talk about African Americans and not just suddenly bring up the BLM or how it's contributed to them or how it's contributed to a lot more of their safety. This is a very assertive argument that we think is just factually untrue. How do we envision celebration? We think that within the community, there's often a lot of public support for this individual and the person in power, specifically mentioning their minority background. So it looks like people celebrating on the streets when these people are elected. The nuance, however, is that it comes with specific focus on the challenges they face as a member of the minority while trying to reach that position. For example, the discrimination they felt when they tried to climb up the economic and political ladder, or for example, the media specifically focusing on their identities and the struggles they face like racism or sexism. The second thing is I think the vast majority of figures are being celebrated because they are trailblazers. So, example, people who were the first of their kind, like Barack Obama or Kamala Harris, have literally broken like stereotypes that they're never able to get into like notable positions of power. I just want to make a note here. I think that while we think that people recognize the symbolic importance of their wins, that doesn't mean that they're irrational, and they're still likely to consider the conduct and platform of these leaders. So, for example, if they become abusive in the future, I think people are likely to weigh that out as voters or supporters. Maybe not going to be vocal about it, but at the very least, not going to support you. They have less willingness to go on the street for you. I think this makes a really visceral impact, which is often a disincentive for these people to abuse them. I'll posit two arguments. First, trailblazers create the impetus to tear structural barriers to power. But secondly, why we think this paves the way for other members of marginalized groups to enter these traditionally discriminatory fields. Firstly, impetus to tear down structural barriers to power. This is important because we generally increase representation and increase the ability for other minorities to access realms of power. There are two layers under this argument. There are three layers under this argument. The first is that this uniquely celebration draws attention to the struggles these individuals face as members of the minority. I want to demonstrate this in three ways. I think one, the celebration uniquely draws attention to the lives of these leaders and the specific role their identity played. This means that you give them a platform to specifically discuss the challenges they face within the system, which probably still exists until like status quo. So we think, just a note, I think structurally the celebration is likely to focus on their challenges, particularly because they are trailblazers, which is that they had something to overcome, and that's make them a very significant figure. So this looks like AOC talking about how it looks like to have men look down on you as a woman. The second demonstration is that the politicians themselves do have an incentive to talk about how they face structural barriers because it makes their achievement look more worthwhile. So they're not just going to talk about hard work, they're going to talk about overcoming discrimination and the fact that they had to work harder than their male or white counterpart. The third is that there's more political will directed at these problems when it comes from a person in a position of power in the form of more social media attention. So, for example, when you're an elected representative, people will listen to you because you already built up that reputation and legitimacy that you do deserve this position. We think it's a lot more willing to persuade and give more awareness to the actual struggles of these individuals. The second layer in this argument is a celebration fuels supports for social movements. I think overcoming the majority bias against you, for example, a lot of moderates inherently doubt social movements because A, they don't believe they can provide tangible reform. But secondly, there's often very little precedence that states give or that people just generally are aware of that these minorities can be competent leaders. So they're often very reluctant to vote these people into power. Trailblazers provide us with a clear signal that the movement is strong and reform is possible, which overcomes a lot of their bias towards apathy. Just to clarify, this is not about Republican politicians, it's about moderates that just generally have a lot of reluctance to vote these people and support these people within power. In their world, this simply does not happen without a widespread social celebration. The third layer in this argument is I think celebrating a minority candidate directly leads to more policies to uplift marginalized groups. So talking about the extent of policies, to be clear, so admittedly, they still have policies under their side, but we just think we have significantly better policies under ours. So I think in their world, even if a minority leader wins, the problem is they didn't explicitly win on a minority vote, which is that they often don't have a direct incentive to make policies that cater to the minority, either as their first priority or second priority. It's like to be a last priority because the reason as to why they won is probably because of white swing voters. Second, the celebration puts pressure on them even after the election to make policies for the marginalized groups. This incentive exists only when you have a celebration, when you make it that you are a possible demographic that the candidate can win on, as opposed to them relying on other swing voters, which probably aren't part of minorities. The second argument I want to posit to you then is why it paves the way for other members of marginalized groups to enter these discriminatory fields at PKPY, if there's any. Okay, this is important because it increases voter turnout and political participation. There are a couple of layers on this argument. The first is that this increases political participation among minority groups. The problem is in status quo is that when members of minority don't feel meaningfully represented, they disengage from the political system and abstain in voting in that system. So for example, during Trump's election, they felt as if Clinton didn't represent them, so there's a low turnout for African Americans. Absent the celebration, even if minority candidates run, they don't campaign explicitly on their identity, so it's like minorities are unlikely to be seen as represented. In fact, they have an incentive to distance themselves from that in order to cater to the majority. But the second is that this encourages more members of the minority to pursue traditionally major-related like fields. So, for example, you gauge yourself more likely to succeed, so you're more willing to run for these types of things. Or, for example, the support that comes from your community is drastically increased. So you feel as if you have a higher chance of winning. You're also likely to get endorsements, which increases your chance of winning, which increases your incentive to actually run and like as a politician for these like for your minority group. So I think that's a great benefit because it means more representation politically. It also means that people are willing to vote more and have higher like voter turnout and more political representation from a system that they previously did not feel like they belonged in. We are very proud to oppose for those reasons.
I thank that speaker for those fine remarks, and I call upon the DPM. Here.
Oh, sorry. David just informed me that he's cutting out. Can we give him like a minute to reconnect? Sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
sure.
Team Sri Lanka is also having some internet issues. Could we please have 2 minutes?
Yes, that is fine.
Maybe
I will also turn off
maybe
my
we
camera.
could turn off. Yeah, thank you. Hi, we're good on our end.
Lovely.
Hey.
Sri Lanka?
Okay, I can hear clearly now. Sorry about that.
No worries. Please let me know if you have internet issues again. I will pause around.
Hi, Team Sri Lanka is back now. Sorry for the delay.
Okay, cool. No worries. All right. Then prop 2 whenever you're ready.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Great. Okay. Preferred pronouns are they, them. I'll be taking POIs verbally. Yeah, just unmute yourself and ask. 1 second, please. I can be heard, yeah?
Yes, you can.
Panel, this debate is becoming parallel. And the reason why this debate is becoming parallel is because the opposition fails to deal with our characterization of what celebration is. Because they've conflated celebration with these individuals talking about their struggles and talking about what they have experienced. And I don't think that those are the same things. I think we're completely fine with it on our side. What we're not okay with is the celebration of these individuals, the putting of them up on a pedestal as different from any other individual from that minority, the placing of them as a figurehead for that movement. That is what we are against. Insofar as they have not dealt with that characterization, they're not dealing with our half of the debate, they're being non-competitive. So I'm going to do like them a favor and I'm going to cross over to their characterization and deal with my analysis in their world, in their best case scenario. So with that being said, I have two themes of rebuttal before my argumentation. The first theme of rebuttal I have is on the image and the image of these individual politicians. And my second theme is going to be on minorities. First theme of rebuttal then on image. Few points of response. Firstly, what is the assumption they're making in their case? The assumption they're making here is that changing the image of this individual is the end goal. Why do I think that that is untrue? Because I don't think it matters whether the image of the White House or of the political establishment is better in the eyes of minorities just because you have more minorities in power. If the systemic slavery of Black people in the US still continues to exist via things like the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, etc. All things that are directly supported by individuals like Kamala Harris for the simple reason that in order to get into power as a minority individual, you're going to have to do things that appeal to the system. Hence why Kamala Harris is a district attorney and is unlikely to want to do things like defund the police, which would actually help Black people. In that world, you're unlikely to get actual systematic change for Black people. So I don't that image matters. Secondly, I don't think we need to support movements with figureheads either. I think that movements actually function better when you aren't really dealing with a figurehead. So I don't think that's what this debate is about. Thirdly, I think that their issue here is that they assume that people now think that they know that they can achieve something. Because I think that the exact opposite is true. Because note that the experience of Kamala Harris is different to other women and is different to other minorities. Because not every minority or every woman has the ability to attend college, has the ability to get a degree, has the ability to even get a job. The reason for that is because Kamala Harris doesn't have the same systemic barriers and walls in front of her that she has to jump over. As a result, I think that minorities are going to be worse off at the point at which they are now unable to actually think of themselves as better, as well as them not having responded to our analysis on right-wingers putting the onus on them to actually make their own lives better when it's not their fault. That is analysis that they still haven't dealt with. Fourthly, under this theme. So let's take their best case. So let's say that you are able to acknowledge success of things like Black Lives Matter in their world. One, that doesn't mean you've created structural change, which matters the most. And secondly, you still have an incentive to not support these things because you have to be a function of the establishment. And as a result, you won't do like these four things directly upend the establishment, because that means that you're unlikely to get support from your peers. Because note that Kamala Harris still needs to get support from Republican politicians insofar as she wants to keep her seat in the midterms. But okay, let's weigh this clash up then. The difference here is on their best case, you get a sense of changing image versus our side, you get actual change. So when you've ignored our analysis on whitewashing of these individuals' reputations, as well as the fact that right-wingers now hurt the individuals of minorities, that is to say, the poorest of these minorities, that is when you fail to win this clash. And I think we take it quite. For my second theme, sure.
This is particularly cherry-picked analysis. Right-wingers will always use you as a counterexample because that's their political agenda. And people like Kamala Harris would still have negative reform in your world. There just wouldn't be any attention on them because they aren't celebrated.
Okay, I don't think that it's true that you don't get attention. I think that like every politician, even someone like the middle of Idaho, gets attention when you're doing something. It doesn't mean, so in our world, Kamala Harris would get attention because of the fact that she is the vice president and she has a platform there. You don't need to celebrate these individuals to give them attention. And I'll deal with that like furthermore in my second theme on minorities. Few points of response. Firstly, what is the assumption they make here? That focusing on the struggle of these individuals is a good thing. One, I don't see how that's exclusive to their side when you have celebration involved. But secondly, I've already told you how these people don't like have the same barriers in front of them. So note that not everyone who is part of this minority can succeed through hard work. At that point, hard work in itself is a privilege. It is a privilege to be able to even access the realm of hard work. And that is not something that everyone can do. But thirdly, why are you unlikely to be able to do things like criticize these leaders? Because now as a minority, you're going to be seen as criticizing your own camp. Because a black person is going to be criticized by his own movement when they've already celebrated Obama, when he tries to criticize Obama for carpet bombing children and being a war criminal in the Middle East. That means that these people have a lack of accountability on them. That means they're more likely to actually do bad things. And that means that these people are going to be seen as even more incompetent leaders. That is the bad movement that you get on your side. But sure, let's say these people do get voted in, like they do get voted in on both sides. They're not conceding that, but on their side, they're voted in purely on race. And that's an issue that I'll deal with in my third argument. But all of this analysis still hasn't proved to us that you get better policy on their side. All you've proven is that you get these people into power. They need to prove by celebration is what's going to make them give you better policy. So lastly, why do I still think that minorities are likely to vote for their own representatives even without celebration? One, because when you see an individual that represents what you look like, even if they're celebrated or not, you're going to want to get them in power. Two, you recognize that there's a social social idea that you should support people that look like you and are likely to support you if these people are going to support you. So I don't think that you're going to lose support for these individuals. So I also don't think it matters whether these individuals' support comes from their own camp or whether it comes from like the white moderate, insofar as they're getting in power and able to put in policy. So at the weighing up of this argument, it brings up how minorities feel on their side versus the actual material conditions of minorities on our side. And I think that matters more. The feelings don't matter at the point at which you're starving to death. Okay. Third argument as to how it sends a demeaning signaling effect. So celebration, what does it do? It signals that there is something unique about this individual in particular coming into power. And recognize that we celebrate these individuals outside of like other majority politicians. That exception then becomes directly in relation to the individual's race. That means that race is now a factor which changes the view of you as a political leader, in that you are seen as an exception. It is extraordinary for you as a minority to be in power. So when minority leaders do get in power, they're always likely to be thought of as an exception and not the norm, which is what we want. So you're unable to actually get normalization of minorities on their side. The moment that every time you have a minority in power, there's something to be celebrated, while a white person in power isn't something to be celebrated. So when you weigh this argument up, even when you get more minorities in power on their side, let's give that to them, their peers don't see them as valid. They themselves don't see them as valid. And as a result, they're less likely to be effective in carrying out proper policy that's likely to actually help people's lives. As far as that is true, I think that we're the side that helps the most vulnerable of minorities, the people who are poor, the people who are minorities within minorities. That is who we stand for on our side, propose.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks. I now call upon the DLO. Here.
Okay. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. Proposition relies on an implausible characterization, which is that there is absolutely no hope of change and that the structural barriers in the societies that celebrate marginalized people who they put in power are so deep and so entrenched that there's no amount of choices that any person in a marginalized group can ever make to get out of power. That is an implausible characterization because the sorts of societies that celebrate these leaders, like the United States, are likely to be societies in which there is at least some acceptance of these struggles, some acceptance that these people are equal and deserve our rights, and that is a reason why it is probably likely that the structural barriers they identify are not so bad, and it is possible for us to access our benefits. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to deal with that extension. Second of all, I'm going to go through the 3 rebuttal issues. First, on whether we minimize the issue of social discrimination. Second, on accountability. Third, on achievement. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how we remove the self-defeating fear of electability, allowing more minority politicians to get in power and enact real change. First, on their extension, which is that the politicians are going to be viewed as tokenistic and only representing their race. The first thing to note is this is implausible, no, on face, because they do not explain why merely celebrating the fact that they've overcome some level of discrimination discrimination is going to essentialize and remove every other aspect about that politician that makes them somebody who you might want to work with. But second of all, there are many political incentives for these individuals to continue to talk about other issues, the fact that they were elected by their peers, the fact that they want to get reelected, etc. Third of all, I don't think they explain how this tokenization actually translates into harms, because even if you view somebody as being a token and you don't think like a token black person, there's still somebody who can vote for or against your bill in Congress. You still want to get them on their side because they have substantive legal power behind them. These are people in positions of power, guys. That's why the extension didn't stand. So let's go on to the first rebuttal issue about which side is better able to create an impetus for getting social change. Their claim is that the celebration of marginalized leaders will never reference barriers, but will only discuss their hard work or will minimize these barriers. But what we explain from Riva to no response is that the celebration inherently involves identifying the structural barriers that these leaders faced and celebrating the fact that they were able to overcome them. The reason why that is the case is because if you didn't identify those barriers, then there wouldn't have been any reason to celebrate the fact that they were in a position of power in the first instance. So this looks like celebrating Nelson Mandela getting in power, not because he's not just because he's a hard worker, but because of the fact that he was thrown in jail, the way he was beaten up by these protesters, highlighting all of these systemic and discriminatory barriers. The only response that they give is that, oh, well, they got in power, so they must have never faced any barriers because Kamala Harris was like upper middle class. This is implausible on face. We think that people from all social classes within even a marginalized group face some level of barriers and oppression. For example, they're probably still likely to face unconscious bias and discrimination. Kamala Harris was literally somebody who was being bused to school. She talked about that in her debate with Joe Biden. So this is something that you can always talk about. But second, their alternative is worse because on their side of the house, you see these leaders in office, they talk about how hard they worked, but there is no racial context or context to explain that why they got there is something which is so extraordinary. That means all of the harms they identify exist. Right-wing people and moderates can point to Kamala Harris on their side and say, look, the discrimination must not be so bad. She got in office. We have a black president. How bad can it be? Those right-wing spoilers and the harms to minorities still happen. Third of all, I think it is unlikely that these barriers are so intensely insufficient or so intensely entrenched that nothing you ever do as a minority can get ahead, and that there's actually choices that you can make that can still increase your likelihood of succeeding. Because in deeply racist societies, you're unlikely to celebrate the sort of leadership that happens in this instance. It's probably likely that these are barriers that are hard to surmount, but still doable. Things like unconscious bias that makes you be perceived as less competent, or things like economic disadvantage, but these are not insurmountable things that you can never overcome. You can still be an exceptional person and do it. But finally, in their best case, I do not think they're hard. So actually, I think that responds to it quite nicely. Let's go on to the, I want to just compare this to the analysis that Riva gives you that was unresponded to about social problems. That is that what we explain is that it is probably true that there has been some progress made, but that there are also harms that are still continuing and existing. This is a plausible characterization of how people think about things on our side of the house. What we explain is that when you celebrate some progress that has occurred, that can galvanize moderates and make them more likely to support social movements that seek to reduce further and entrenched discrimination. The reason is because now they think it's a possibility to do so. On your side of the house, when the narrative is that these things are insurmountable and can never be replaced, that is a world in which white moderates are unlikely to donate their money to BLM because they think it's never going to change. That is a world in which people are unlikely to take time out of their day to engage in actually benefiting or to go to protests, etc. That meant that it was more likely on our side that we got systemic reform. Second clash on political accountability. Their claim is that you can never hold these people accountable because you always view them as these figureheads. First of all, we think that voters are largely retrospective in the way that they evaluate any politician, i.e., after a politician has been elected, they decide whether that politician enacted policies that harmed or helped their lived experiences, like whether the economy was harmed, et cetera, and that means that they're able to rationally consider if this person does bad policies, and they prioritize that over some narrative that they heard. But finally, we explain that voters can separate the idea of a symbolic figurehead from the fact that this could still be a problematic person. There are many think pieces, and there are many people who express how they feel hopeful that Kamala Harris was elected, but also saddened that she was a prosecutor. I think it's kind of weird they think minorities or even moderates don't have the intellectual capacity to do these things all at once. Finally, I contest the characterization, or if it is true, as they say, that these minorities that the system is so entrenched that in order to rise to power, you inevitably have to do things that are compromising, that are evil. Like, for example, Kamala Harris was a prosecutor, which is apparently bad. If that is the case, that is a reason why on neither side of the House, the politicians that get elected are actually the ones who are going to be able to get change. So that explains why they don't get their benefit either. I'll take a point.
Given the fact that Kamala Harris told young girls that they will all be able to make it where she is one day, how do you think a girl who's not even able to like go to school will feel when she's not able to get to those positions one day?
I think even though that girl doesn't have an education, she's probably intelligent enough to understand that barriers exist in her life and that this is an unfortunate reality. I think that for the vast majority of young African-American women, this is still something that they can aspire to and should aspire to. And this is the third thing, because what Riva explains to you in the argument about achievement is that it is far better to tell people that there is a plausible chance that they're able to reach for something better, because we think it's a collective action problem, right? If everybody's told that they can't succeed, nobody's going to try, right? We think that when people try, even if there are barriers, you just increase the chance of somebody getting in power. The more people are attempting to do this, the more people are applying for promotions in their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And the process is that as more people get into power, these barriers get eliminated. There are more Black CEOs and upper level management who can then hire the lower level people. So what that means is you need some impetus to get people to join in the first place. This is a hopeful narrative that explains that to them. This explains why it is more likely that more people actually end up in positions of power on our side, and we reduce all of the racial and discriminatory barriers that we said. It was implausible for them to claim that change was never going to happen. We explain why it is more likely that it can happen on our side with a hopeful narrative proposed.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks, and I'll call upon the prop whip here. Also, David, is your Wi-Fi fine? I'm noticing that there are 4 red bars.
Oh, I mean, I can hear clearly now, so I think it's fine.
Great.
Hi, sorry, can you give us a second? Third speaker has gone to get some water.
Okay, cool.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Just give me a second. I'll start this speech with 3 clarifications. First, on a counterfactual. Because on our side of the House, we never said that minority politicians can't talk about the struggles that they face to get into office. The distinction and the nuance in our case was that this struggle is not talked about in the language of celebration. That is to say, on their side of the House, the personal attributes and qualities, the amount of hard work that individuals put into their studies or their campaign are seen as the deciding factor between an individual from a minority who doesn't succeed and the particular individual who was able to succeed. This isn't the kind of framing that would exist on our world, where we don't look at these issues in the frame of celebration. So notably, you can still talk about the struggles of these individuals in a racial context, but you point to things like their relative underprivileged compared to other individuals who belong to the minority as being an important and deciding factor in their success. So notably, on their side of the house, there's still going to exist politicians, for example, who come from minority backgrounds who probably would have worked even harder than Obama. But when you tell these individuals that only if you had worked just a little bit more, that would have been the deciding factor for you to succeed, it is still a fundamentally demeaning narrative. The counterfactual we support is far more realistic. Secondly, this debate naturally assumes a trade-off, because why would we be having this debate in the first place? But they also never responded to our analysis about how media is a zero-sum game, about how the even liberal moderates have a limited quota of how much they are willing to dedicate their time to discuss and place interest on things like minority issues. So on their side of the house, when they celebrate the identity, the personal attributes, and the life story of an individual minority politician, that detracts from being able to talk about social movements and the broader outcomes of those individuals. At best, you get a particular discussion of only the issues that those individuals would have faced. I think that's unfair to the vast majority of individuals, because Kamala Harris isn't representative of the overall African-American community. But thirdly, I'm going to very quickly respond to this idea that you lack an incentive on our side of the house to work. For minorities, and particularly for minorities from underprivileged backgrounds, there's already a natural incentive to overcome struggle and work hard, because they want to alleviate themselves from the conditions that they have been born into. So individuals are still relatively aspirational on our side of the house. The difference is when they face roadblocks, proposition would have them be told that only if you worked a little bit harder, you would be able to get through these things. This neglects the reality of the situation that they face and often creates cognitive dissonance between individuals on the ground who understand the struggles that they face are part of a broader and structurally racist societies, and politicians and symbolic trailblazers at the top who spew this kind of narrative. I'm going to have two questions in this speech. Firstly, about political leaders and on which side we facilitate the interests of the progressive movement. Secondly, about political discourse and the counterfactual. The first idea then on political leaders. And what proposition lacks is characterization about who political leaders are and their interests. This was given to you through both of our speeches, but very quickly, what are the incentives of political leaders? Firstly, the way that they get into office is by pandering to a majority voter base. This means that their interests as legislators shift based on the shifting interests of voters as well. The implication of this is that oftentimes issues are cyclic in nature, because that's how the media works. So even if at a particular point in time, the Black Lives Matter movement and structural racism is a hot button political issue, over time, as interest in that movement diminishes, there is an incentive for these individuals to distance themselves from the movements that help them get into power. But secondly, they consider that people often live in a structural racist society, and that's why there's a reason to celebrate them in the first place. This means that for the politicians who succeed and get into higher office, that they often have to pander to the existing establishment in order to be able to do so, for things like funding and media attention. So Kamala Harris was a person who pandered to the DNC and its liberal elites to get things like media during the Democratic National Convention. But thirdly, oftentimes the way in which minority politicians are used is as a form of tokenization, to be simply included in the cabinet for you to have the political capital to be able to say that you have a minority as a part of your office. But even if none of these things were true, their own analysis cuts into this, because the fact that you are only able to evaluate the quality of a politician retrospectively means that there is a 4-year gap between the actions of individuals where they cannot express the interests of minorities while they're in office, and you're only able to correct for that after 4 years. Notably, in an instance where like racial minorities already face things like redlining and structural barriers to prevent them from voting, it's already difficult to hold these political leaders accountable. All of this means that minority leaders are often poor ambassadors for the communities that they come from, that they come from the most privileged elements of this community. And even if they have a personal investment into this community, they are at best powerless to be able to represent those individuals, and at worst, over time, their interest in representing their community diminishes. Let's place this in the context then of the analysis that we gave you. Why is celebrating these minority leaders a bad thing? Firstly, because it reduces accountability. They never responded to analysis that we heard in first speech about how whitewashing individuals is a necessary part of celebrating these people. But secondly, the incentives of supporters of these political leaders is that they have already had a sunk cost investment, because you've already celebrated these individuals, like how you celebrated Obama, for example, in the 2004 election at the immediate point in time that he has voted. This locks in your political preferences, because people often have an incentive to remain consistent with their past beliefs. This means that even if, as Obama goes through his 4-year term, he does things that aren't in the interest of minorities, like a hardline migration policy, it is difficult for his past supporters to be able to criticize that in the now. Importantly, this means that you can't hold these leaders accountable, that oftentimes the structural incentives to work against the interests of minorities overpower the ability of the minority to hold these leaders accountable. Before I move on, I'll take your.
This entire accusation about accountability is strange because the characterization you give from second prop is that minorities would vote for them either way.
I don't think we ever really said that, right? So the analysis very specifically is that it's difficult to hold these individuals accountable because you have a sunk cost investment into these people. It's unclear the link between what you just said and the impact that you're trying to prove. The second clash then on shifting political discourse. I want to frame at the top of this clash the important analysis that we brought you from first that they never responded to, which is the model minority myth, which is often the case that the reason that we live in a structurally racist society is because of the failures of the state. The ability to celebrate specific individuals who are able to rise above the din then becomes an opportunity to place the burden on solving structural racism squarely on the shoulders of individuals from that minority. You see this in the Asian community in the US, for example, where they are told that if you work hard enough, you can overcome structural barriers. In opposition to own language, that structural barriers are simply an unfortunate reality, when in reality, there are things that can be solved through effective government policy. But secondly, why do we still get discussion of minority issues on our side of the house? Political leaders aren't the forerunners of the progressive movement. They are political opportunists who use existing political capital to pivot their way into public office. This means on our side of the house, there's a surplus of political capital and interest in social movements and what they have to say that already exists. Comparatively, on our side of the house, social movements have more free rein because they are no longer beholden to the politicians who capitalize on media attention because they are celebrated in the press. We cut off the middleman and have the ability for political movements to go directly to supporters, to push them to support their own individual candidates, giving in to things like more racially favorable policies. And this is important because social movements already need to say politically infeasible things. This means in the long term, we shift the interests of moderates who on their side of the house are complacent. There are hundreds of thousands of white people, for example, who probably would have just voted for Obama and done nothing beyond that. How this solves structural racism is something that they have yet to prove in all of their speeches. For all of these reasons, side with side opposition.
I thank that speaker for their final remarks. I now call upon Op3 Uplip. Here.
Hello, is it okay? It's not choppy, just checking.
Yep, sounds fine.
Great. I'll take POIs in chat. If I disconnect, please just inform me. Start in 3, 2, 1. Upon entering this debate, Proposition wanted to deprive minorities of agency, provide them with no meaningful path to reparations, and tell them that their leaders are terrible people, that all they should have for themselves are low expectations. They pigeonhole themselves into broad attacks on Kamala Harris. We talked to you about trailblazers like AOC, like Lenny Robredo, like the host of other people that paved the way to better things and increased representation, to no response except a few quibbles about Kamala Harris being bad. 2 issues in this speech. First, how it impacts the ability of minorities to access positions of power, and second, how it affects marginalized communities' perceptions of traditionally exclusive fields like politics. But before that, I think I want to clarify what the celebration is, because their characterization and the shift in the characterization they run is borderline squirreling in this debate. I think there are 3 things that are exclusive to the celebration and that you ought to consider. Firstly, a broader platform, particularly within those communities. So yes, you might still be vice president in their world. The difference is you reach more people within that community in our world when you are celebrated by that community. Second, we told you from first that it's about how you're framed. Rather than it being your individual success as someone who came to become vice president, it is specifically that you are the first African-American vice president or the first female vice president in a country. But thirdly, I have no idea why you can't thank the community and credit others for the support they give you when it is a celebration. They simply assert that it is a characterization of meritocracy, there's no analysis from them there. And I want to point out, the line they give from second prop that they deny at third prop is damning for their case. They say minorities will still vote for you because you look like them and they feel represented. What that means is all of their pragmatic harms about not being able to hold these people accountable, about Kamala Harris being terrible for the minority, will still accrue in their world. The difference is that the minority has no ability to control the image of Kamala Harris in that instance. I think they lose the debate on that ground. First issue, how does the celebration impact the ability of minorities to access positions of power? There are three sub-issues I want to analyze under this. The first is the question of how it frames these individuals in relation to the broader struggles of their identity. They claim politicians will resort to narratives of hard work and ignore structural barriers. This is asserted and insufficient for three reasons. One, we explain that politicians themselves have strong incentives to highlight structural discrimination. They want to make their achievements seem worthwhile, so they're going to play up the role that discrimination did in their lives in order to make their achievements seem greater by their own logic of being self-interested. Secondly, we explained that the media has the incentive to focus on the challenges they face rather than just their personal characteristics. They're going to you because you are a minority leader. They could go to any other leader if they just wanted to hear a spiel about hard work. But thirdly, we explained that it is uniquely the community that gets to control the narrative and how they relate to it. So specifically, if I'm an African American and I'm uneducated, maybe I don't listen to Obama's spiel about how he has like a 160 IQ or whatever, but I listen to the fact of how he overcame structural barriers and how he was discriminated against even in office. The impact of winning this sub-issue is twofold for the case that they simply ignore. One, you do get discussions about structural discrimination, and you get more of them in our world when you get the broader platform of celebration. Take note, the margin in this debate is those discussions of like discrimination reach the communities where those people are being celebrated. In their world, even if they do occur, they exist in a vacuum. I have no idea how that reaches people on the ground. But secondly, we explain from first that you get legitimacy and scale for these issues. We explain that when it comes from the Vice President of the US, probably there is more sufficient backing to it. There's more sufficient understanding of how deep underlying discrimination goes. The second sub-issue under this is the question then of how political opponents are likely to use this. They say they're likely to use this to scapegoat and say minorities can achieve things without providing reform. First of all, I think this is largely going to happen in their world as well. I don't see why Donald Trump is going to be nicer towards minorities or not exploit the image of his political opponents. But secondly, I explained that one step further, that it gets worse in their world because there's less of a platform to correct that. When Kamala Harris isn't celebrated by African American communities and she has no platform within that community, Donald Trump can use her image against her while she cannot say anything and not talk about the experiences she faced to counter that. It is far worse of an impact in their world. The third sub-issue under this is on the electability of these candidates. Take note, they assume, and actually they assert that these candidates will still win in their world. I think this is largely untrue. Firstly, on the part of voters, because it is harder to vote for a minority candidate when you don't think that person can win in the first place, when there isn't an image of celebration that says this is a landslide victory for your identity and you ought to continue to vote for minority candidates in the future. But secondly, also on behalf of these political parties and institutions that decide who get to run, we explain that it's important to have trailblazers so this becomes a path for others in the future, so you direct political capital to it. At the end of this issue, we are winning the debate on net because we give more space to the very things they care about. Till this point in the debate, there's no counterfactual at all from them except weak attempts at co-option which end up harming their case, or assertions that social movements will somehow have the same platform without any explanation why social movements have any incentive to be catered to by the movement, by the media, given that they aren't big political figures. Before second issue, I'll take a POI. Hello?
On our side of the House, the only politically feasible impact of celebration that you talk about is widening a platform. On our side of the House, if you're able to widen the platform, is there then not a reason to celebrate these individuals?
First of all, you don't widen the platform because you only widen the platform when you get the celebration of these people. There's no incentive to give you more of a platform if you don't have an intrinsic link to that community. And certainly people in the community won't care about you. I think I'm relatively clear with this. I already addressed it. Second issue, how does this affect marginalized communities' perceptions of traditionally exclusive fields like politics? We explained that the problem in the vast majority of these cases is disengagement from the political system. Is minorities not believing they can succeed succeed, and therefore not just striving for these positions, but refusing to engage with the system as a whole. What were the responses you got to that, and why are they insufficient? The first thing they said is it doesn't matter if these people win because they enact horrible policies for minorities like Kamala Harris. One, I think this is going to exist in either side. Like Kamala Harris was a district attorney long before she was vice president of the US. The margin then in this debate is when she becomes vice president of the US and she is celebrated by the African American community. A lot of the issues that she did during her term are also brought to light because we explain that voters are rational, and while they can consider one aspect of someone's victory worthwhile, that doesn't mean they whitewash all the other aspects of it. But second, even if they do, there is no comparative in their world. What happens when a white candidate wins? What happens when someone who wants to perpetuate the system continues to win and is continue to be able to oppress minorities in their world? I think we just get no response to that. The second thing the second question under this issue then is, how does this affect social movements? They say attention is taken away, and their only mechanism from this is that airtime is exclusive. I want to take note, can't just say that airtime is exclusive, that there's a trade-off in airtime. They have to prove why the airtime given to political figures would then be directed to other social movements of that minority. I would suggest the more likely instance is that they'd still be directed to other political figures. So white vice presidents, white politicians, people with no incentive to talk about minority-specific issues. Secondly, we explain that even if it is the case that we take something away from social movements, we get larger buy-in for those movements as a whole, because these movements are often seen as tokenistic, often seen as being toothless and having no capacity to reform. In order to get members and moderates to buy into that, you need some tangible success you can bank on. This is why we're able to have discussions of BLM in the mainstream. This issue is particularly debate-winning, even on their grounds opposed.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks, and now call upon op reply. Here.
Okay. I want to begin by pointing out the tensions that are causing Proposition's case to crumble before our eyes. From second prop, they say, minorities are going to vote for these politicians either way in response to our arguments. But then they try to run an argument that accountability is impossible only on our side, and it is on their side when minorities can actually consider whether these people are good. From first prop, they say that the setup is that it's that it is the case that these countries are so structurally racist, like Kamala is a cop, but that these politicians have to cater to the racist systems. But from third prop, they tell you that suddenly these politicians are going to become super progressive in the way that they talk about and discuss race by highlighting their own privilege and denigrating their own achievements in a way that probably isn't very politically popular for them. This was an implausible case that we heard from Proposition. It's not one that can win the debate. There are two issues. First, on social change. Second, on the accomplishment of individual minorities. First, on social change. I want to highlight that the argument that we give you about how it is the case that that majorities are able to opt into these social movements that benefit minorities more when they think that there is a plausible chance of success of these movements because of the celebration of progress that exists receives no response. And that explains why the power of these social movements becomes exponentially greater on our side of the house, because we have allies from moderate groups, which makes it far easier to get far-ranging reform like they wanted to talk about, things like better welfare policies for these individuals or better laws against hate crimes. This also responds to their argument about the opportunity cost of media, because even if there's more media attention paid to these social movements, they do not explain why it is the case that there's a greater likelihood of buy-in. We are the side that explains that, so we win that clash. Let's go on to the only line of analysis they had about social change, which is why it was the case that this narrative would be one of pure merit and it would never highlight the structural barriers. They give you no reasons as to why this is likely to be true. What we explain is that it has to highlight these structural barriers because otherwise it is not worth celebrating somebody if they didn't overcome some sort of oppression or some sort of hardship in their life. So what this explains is why it does indeed highlight these structural barriers and make people more aware. We think people are reasonable enough to understand and hold two ideas in their mind. That this is an individual who worked exceptionally hard and ought to be celebrated, but also that these structural barriers are unfair and we should change them. Compare that to what they give you, which is absolutely no reasons why it's better on their side. Because absent the fact that they assert from third prop that it is the case that suddenly these politicians are going to be able to talk progressively about their racial identity. What happens on their side is that these politicians are still in power. They just aren't celebrated for overcoming these barriers. So the assumption is still that they worked hard and that they got there. There's just no mention of these barriers whatsoever. What that means is that it's easier for right-wing spoiler candidates to say things like, oh, look at that guy, he got in power, why can't you? You must not be working hard enough. And minorities can't respond with, yeah, but he overcame all of those barriers because he's an exceptional individual. These are still unfair things that we should fight against. That co-opts the single biggest benefit that they wanted to posit. And I think that is the reason why we win on the biggest clash, which is about social issues, the clash that they wanted to claim. But the second issue is about the individual accomplishment of minorities. And they dropped this clash entirely until they decided to respond to it from third prop by saying that there are natural incentives for minorities to do well either. The problem is that this does not respond to the analysis that we give you, which is that there's a bigotry of soft expectations and that minorities do not think that they can plausibly succeed in these instances in the first place, because this wasn't about things like applying for a job so that you wouldn't be unemployed and get food or things like your basic necessities. It was trying to reach for positions of power, like asking for a promotion at work, like running for local office, etc., etc. These are things that you're intuitively unlikely to do unless you think there's a reasonable chance of success. We explain why giving these people a sign of hope makes them more likely to enter into those fields, makes it more likely for you to have a positive and virtuous cycle of having more people in power. And that was why it was better on our side of the house. We're very proud to.
I thank that speaker for the remarks, and I'll call upon Prop Reply to close this debate as a whole. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Panel, I'm going to ignore the fact that the majority of their analysis came out in their op3 and reply, and I'm going to deal with the crux of their case in my reply speech. So a few key reasons why we are actually doing this debate. One, the fact that they haven't dealt with the actual characterization that we give you, just some like half-baked version that they thought of in prep, not the actual nuances that we talked to you about, where we said that these individuals would talk about racism without celebration, in that you're now seen as in that position because of relative privilege, just like any other politician, not exclusively because of your race. But second, for any of their analysis to work, they need to say by not celebrating this individual is the same thing as not providing them with a platform. So in that, I'd say that their entire side is not nuancing the argumentation to ideas of celebration. All of their like argument can be just as easily made towards like a debate on media focus. They have to debate the actual motion. So 4 key things there. 1, they didn't respond to our idea on how media is zero-sum. 2, they didn't respond to the idea on how this is unfair to the vast majority of minorities. 3, they didn't respond to the analysis that I gave you and that Chandu gave you, that minorities will always have an incentive to work hard and vote for their politicians. And 5th, they didn't respond to our entire third argument as to why these politicians now have less confidence in themselves that makes them less effective. So I think on all of those like levels, we've already won this debate, and that's that. So since I have 2.5 minutes still left, I'll take you to the clashes in this debate. First clash in this debate is on political leaders. What are the incentives of political leaders? 1, we told you that the way they get into office is by pandering to the majority. 2, that they have an incentive to distance themselves from hot button issues after they get into power. 3, the fact that they have a responsibility and an incentive to pander to the establishment. 4, the fact that they're used as a form of tokenization means that they solely exist as a bargaining chip and not to actually engage any policy of our own. As a result of that, I say that those incentives make it more powerful than any other moral incentive that they might have cooked up in the prep room, which means that these political leaders aren't going to create as much change, but that is different now on our side when you actually celebrate them. Secondly, the analysis as to how you can hold these individuals responsible retrospectively still only gives you an opportunity every 4 years, unlike when you're able to hold them like responsible through the marketplace of ideas every single day on our side. So even when you get more minorities in power on their side, we've given you the analysis, and even then we like weighed it out during my speech and Chanindu's as to why they're less likely to be effective. So tying this back to the motion, why is celebrating bad? One, because it reduces accountability via the whitewashing of these individuals' reputation. When you're able to hold these individuals accountable, you have more people invested within politics. Secondly, there is a sunk cost by media and by individuals who vote for this group, which means that you've locked in their preferences and you hurt minorities because they're forced to vote for individuals that don't don't uphold their own values, and that hurts that idea of rationality that they gave on your side. So we dealt with that from like the top of our case as well. Second clash in this debate was on systemic change and discourse. Firstly, they haven't responded at all to our idea of the model minority myth, in that you now put the onus on these individuals to solve their own lives. But secondly, why do we still get discourse on our side? Because note that Chaniku's analysis on surplus of political capital wasn't responded to. That gives more free rein to social movements because they have a larger chunk of the media pie when you're not celebrating these individuals. Because note that politicians don't create media capital. They only pivot it and use it to their own benefit. This was analysis in my argument as well as in Chaniku's speech that wasn't responded to. But lastly, when you give these individuals the idea that they have succeeded greatly, that's their absolute best impact, that still means that you get the idea of complacency that they haven't responded to. So I think on both of these clashes, we've created a better world on our side without celebration. That is why celebration is unjust and also why we win this debate. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech and the teams for the debate as a whole. What will happen now is myself and my panelists will go to the deliberation room and come to a decision and then come back. Wait, is there a deliberate? Yes, there is.